I heard you needed a wife, the Apache woman said. I told her, then stay here with me. James had never felt so alone in his life. The frontier settlement was small and scattered, and winter had left the land cold and unforgiving. His cabin stood at the edge of the woods, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed with the wind, their branches creaking like old doors. The snow had melted only recently, leaving behind patches of mud and frozen streams. Every morning he awoke to the sound of birds searching for food and the distant calls of settlers tending their chores. Yet, no matter how busy he kept himself, an emptiness lingered. Life on the frontier was hard, and he had no one to share it with. He had heard the whispers in town, quiet comments from neighbors and travelers alike. "A man like you needs a wife," they would say, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with judgment.
James had never married.
He had thought perhaps he would meet someone when the town grew larger, or when life became less difficult. But as the months passed, he realized that the solitude was beginning to weigh on him more than he could admit. The house felt bigger than it was, the nights darker, and the cold sharper. One afternoon, as he was chopping wood near the edge of the forest, he heard footsteps. Not the soft, careful steps of a settler trying to avoid the mud, but firm, confident footsteps that belonged to someone who knew the land. He paused and looked up, the axe still in his hands. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a woman he had never seen before. Her hair was long and dark, tied loosely at the back, and her eyes were sharp, yet full of a quiet warmth. She wore a simple dress, practical and sturdy, and carried a small bundle on her back. I heard you needed a wife, she said, her voice clear and strong. The word surprised James so much that he almost dropped his axe. He stared at her, unsure if he had heard correctly. He had expected gossip, whispers, or advice, but never a direct declaration like this. I don't know what you mean, he stammered. He felt a strange mix of fear, curiosity, and admiration. She did not wait for him to answer. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning his cabin, the surrounding forest, and finally resting on him. I heard them talking in town, she said, as if reading his thoughts. They said a man like you could use help. I told her, then stay here with me.
Her confidence and honesty caught him completely off guard. James had lived his life following rules, expectations, and routines, but this woman seemed to exist outside all of that.
She was not afraid of him, or of what others might think. She had come with purpose, with strength, and perhaps even with a challenge. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and pine. James felt a curious warmth in his chest, a sense of possibility he had not felt in years. He had expected loneliness, and instead he found presence, someone who was as real and as raw as the land itself. Finally, he found his voice. I don't know if I can offer what you think you want, he said cautiously. Life here is not easy. I can't promise comfort or safety. The land is harsh, and he trailed off, unable to articulate the mixture of awe and uncertainty he felt. She smiled, but it was not a smile meant to soften or appease him. It was a smile that spoke of understanding and quiet strength. I do not need comfort, she said simply. I do not need promises. I only need truth and effort. You have the courage to live here, and that is enough to start.
Most people in the settlement would have laughed at such a suggestion, dismissed it, or judged her for speaking so boldly.
But this woman, Nina, he learned her name later, was different. She was honest, brave, and entirely her own person. Her words cut through the years of doubt and fear he had carried, revealing a part of him that had longed for connection, respect, and companionship.
The two of them began to walk together through the clearing.
James felt awkward at first, unsure how to behave, what to say, or how to respond. Nina, however, moved with ease, her steps light but purposeful, as if she belonged to the land in a way he could only dream of. She pointed out edible plants, taught him how to spot tracks in the mud, and even helped him identify the different calls of birds and animals in the forest. Her knowledge was vast, practical, and deeply connected to the world around them. As the day passed, James realized how little he truly knew about survival, about the land, and about life beyond the small circle of settlers he had grown up around. Nina's presence was both humbling and inspiring. She spoke of her family, her people, and the traditions she had grown up with, painting pictures of a life that seemed rich, complex, and full of wisdom. James listened, absorbing every word, recognizing that this encounter was not merely a visit, it was an opening to something larger than himself.
By evening, the sky had turned a deep shade of orange and purple, and the first stars began to appear.
Nina looked at James, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "You can choose to live in fear," she said softly, "or you can choose to live fully."
Life here is not simple, but it is real.
You are capable of more than you know.
James felt the weight of her words. They were not commands or criticisms. They were truths, offered without judgment. For the first time in a long while he felt seen, not just as a lonely settler struggling with survival, but as a man capable of growth, change, and connection. Bess. That night, as Nina made a small fire outside the cabin and prepared simple food for them both, James sat quietly watching the flames flicker. He thought about the isolation he had endured, the rumors he had heard, and the emptiness that had settled into his days. And now, here was someone who had entered his life with honesty and courage, offering partnership not out of obligation, but out of choice. James realized that he had never truly considered what it meant to have a partner. Not just a companion to manage chores, but someone to share life with, someone to challenge him, teach him, and grow alongside him. And he knew that Nina, with her unwavering presence and quiet strength, could be that person. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, James felt a new sense of hope. The world outside was still harsh and demanding, but inside that small cabin, with the wind rustling the trees and Nina by his side, he felt the stirrings of something he had never dared hope for: connection, understanding, and the possibility of a shared life. And in that moment, as the first snowflakes of winter began to drift down silently from the sky, James understood that life was no longer just about survival. It was about courage, choice, and the unexpected ways in which people could enter one another's lives and change them forever. The days that followed brought a rhythm to James's life that he had never experienced before. The harshness of frontier life remained, but with Nina's presence, it no longer felt unbearable.
Every morning, the first light of dawn found them walking through the woods together.
Nina's footsteps were confident, her knowledge of the land precise. She showed James how to identify edible roots, where to find fresh water, and how to track the movements of animals in ways he had never imagined. At first, James stumbled often. He tripped over roots, misread tracks, and occasionally got lost. Each time Nina would gently correct him, her patience endless. "Watch the ground," she would say.
Listen to the wind. Nature speaks if you know how to hear it. Her words, simple yet profound, made James realize how much he had relied on routine and habit rather than paying attention.
Life, he began to understand, demanded more than effort. It demanded awareness. Despite the practical lessons, there was more to learn than survival. Nina shared stories of her people, the Apache, their traditions, their connection to the land, and their respect for all living things. She spoke of her family, her childhood, and the lessons her elders had passed down. James listened with awe. The stories were not merely tales, they were guides, maps of a life lived with understanding and harmony. He could see why she moved through the world with such ease and confidence. At the same time, James tried to share his own life with her. He told her about his childhood in the settlement, the hard work his parents had endured, and the loneliness he had felt as he grew older. He showed her the ways he had learned to farm and hunt, the small improvements he had made to the cabin, and the routines he had developed to survive the harsh seasons. At first, he worried that she would dismiss his life as small or insignificant, but instead she nodded and listened, asking questions, encouraging him to see the value in his own experiences. As the days turned into weeks, a quiet understanding grew between them. They began to anticipate each other's actions without speaking, finishing chores together efficiently and developing a shared sense of purpose. When Nina worked in the garden, James helped, learning which seeds to plant and when. When James went hunting, she taught him how to move quietly, how to read the tracks of animals, and how to respect the balance of the land. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, a bond that grew stronger with each shared task. Yet, their growing closeness was not without tension. There were moments when misunderstandings flared. James struggled with certain Apache customs that Nina held dear, and she sometimes found his ways clumsy or careless. Once, he accidentally damaged a small herbal patch she had carefully tended. She was upset, and James felt a sharp pang of guilt. "I didn't mean to," he said, his voice low and apologetic. She looked at him, her expression serious. "Intentions are not enough," she said softly. "You must learn to see and respect what exists, not just what you think exists." Her words struck him deeply. He realized that life was not just about effort or intention. It was about understanding, empathy, and observation. He had spent so long moving through life focused only on survival that he had overlooked the subtle lessons the world offered. Desperation. Nina was teaching him to slow down, to notice, and to honor the balance of life around him. Outside their cabin, the settlement continued its usual rhythm. Other settlers noticed the unusual partnership forming between James and Nina. Some whispered, their words filled with judgment or curiosity. Others shook their heads, skeptical of the bond between a settler and an Apache woman. James felt the weight of their eyes and words, but found that he no longer feared judgment in the same way. Nina's presence had given him courage, the quiet strength to live authentically rather than merely conforming to expectations. Despite the scrutiny, James and Nina found joy in small moments. They laughed together at mistakes, celebrated minor successes, and shared stories in the evenings by the fire. Nina taught him how to weave baskets and make simple clothing repairs. James showed her how to cook some of the settler recipes he remembered from his youth, and together they created meals that blended both traditions. It was not just a sharing of skills, but a sharing of life, an exchange that deepened their bond and strengthened their trust. One afternoon, as they worked near a small stream, Nina stopped and looked at James with a serious expression. "You are learning quickly," she said. "But do you understand why this matters?" James looked at her, confused. "I know how to track animals, gather food, and survive," he said. "Breath. Isn't that enough?" Nina shook her head gently. "Survival is only part of life. To live fully, you must understand balance, respect, and patience. You must know when to act and when to wait." "Oh, you must listen to the land, the wind, and the water. Life is more than work. It is connection." Breath. Feeling the truth in her words, he realized that he had been so focused on surviving that he had never considered the deeper meaning of life. He began to see that his relationship with Nina was not just about companionship. It was a guide, a way to understand the world more fully. Her lessons were not easy, but they were honest, and honesty was something he had come to value more than comfort or ease. As the days grew warmer with the coming of spring, they ventured farther from the cabin. Nina showed James hidden groves where berries grew, taught him which herbs could heal minor injuries, and even led him to secret fishing spots along the river. Each journey into the forest strengthened their trust. James began to rely on her knowledge and intuition, while Nina learned to appreciate his determination and willingness to try, even when he failed. Their bond began to shift from practical cooperation to something deeper. There were quiet moments when they would sit together by the fire, sharing stories of their past, reflecting on their dreams and fears. James found himself drawn to Nina not just for her skills and wisdom, but for her courage, her laughter, and her unwavering honesty. She challenged him, encouraged him, and held him accountable in ways no one else had. One evening, as the sun set in the brilliant shades of orange and pink, Nina turned to James with a smile. "You have come far," she said.
You are learning more than survival. You are learning life. James felt warmth in his chest, a mix of pride and humility.
He realized that their partnership was teaching him lessons far beyond the forest, the cabin, or even the settlement. It was teaching him about patience, respect, courage, and the power of choosing to walk beside someone rather than alone. But life was not without its challenges. The settlement's residents continued to watch, some with suspicion, others with curiosity. James began to feel the strain of judgment and the weight of societal expectations. Yet, every time he looked at Nina, he felt reassured. Her calm strength reminded him that life was about more than the opinions of others. It was about living truthfully, respecting the land and each other, and finding courage in unexpected places. Breaths. Slowly, James came to understand what Nina had meant the first day she spoke to him. Life was not merely survival. It was about connection, understanding, and trust. And with Nina by his side, he began to see a future that had once seemed impossible. A future where two very different people could build a life together, learn from each other, and face challenges not with fear but with respect and partnership. The bond between them continued to grow, quietly but steadily, like the river that ran near their cabin, sometimes gentle, sometimes powerful, but always moving forward. James no longer felt the gnawing loneliness that had haunted him for so long. He felt alive in ways he had never imagined, and he realized that life on the frontier, harsh as it could be, held moments of beauty, connection, and profound learning if one had the courage to embrace them. And so day by day, step by step, they built a rhythm together, a rhythm of work, learning, laughter, and trust. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, to celebrate small victories, and to face challenges as a team. James knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that, with Nina beside him, he could face whatever came. Together they were stronger, wiser, and more alive than either had been alone. Spring had arrived in full force, painting the land in bright greens and golds. Flowers bloomed along the edges of the forest. Birds returned to sing in the morning, and the river, swollen with melted snow, ran fast and strong. Life seemed alive everywhere, but with life came challenges, and James and Nina were about to face one that would test everything they had learned together. It began on a warm afternoon. James and Nina had ventured further than usual, exploring a section of forest along the river they had not seen before. The trees grew taller and thicker, creating shadows that danced in the sunlight. Nina moved with ease, stepping over roots and rocks without a sound, while James followed, careful not to fall behind. As they neared a bend in the river, they noticed movement in the distance. A small group of settlers had gathered near a clearing, their voices raised in panic. Curious, James quickened his pace, and Nina matched him step for step. As they drew closer, they realized the settlers were struggling to protect their livestock from a sudden flood. Heavy rains upstream had caused the river to rise quickly, threatening to sweep away cows, horses, and supplies. James's heart raced. He had faced hard work, cold winters, and hunger. But this was different. The threat was sudden, dangerous, and beyond his control. He looked at Nina, hoping for guidance, and saw the same determination in her eyes that he had first noticed weeks ago. Without a word, she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the riverbank. They worked together, moving quickly to help the settlers secure the animals. Nina showed James how to tie ropes around the livestock to prevent them from being carried away by the strong current. She instructed him on where to anchor lines to trees and rocks, how to push animals to higher ground, and when to stay calm rather than panic. Her confidence inspired James, and he realized that his fears could not control him. He had to act. Hours, in a blur of movement, shouting, and struggle, the river roared, water rushing over rocks and branches, and the settlers fought to save what they could. James found himself working side by side with Nina, trusting her instincts completely. There were moments when he wanted to give up, when the water seemed too strong and the danger too great. But Nina's calm presence kept him grounded.
"We do not fight the river," she said. "We work with it." By late afternoon, after tireless effort, they managed to move most of the animals to safety.
Wet, exhausted, and muddy, James and Nina finally took a moment to breathe. He looked at her, feeling admiration and gratitude in equal measure. She was more than a teacher or a guide. She was a partner in the truest sense. Together, they had faced danger and survived. The settlers, though exhausted and shaken, expressed their gratitude. Some clapped James on the back. Others nodded respectfully to Nina. It was clear that this partnership, though unusual in the eyes of the settlement, had saved lives and livestock that day. James felt a quiet pride, not in his own strength alone, but in the way they had worked together. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, James and Nina returned to their cabin. Both were silent for a while, tired but filled with a sense of accomplishment. Nina finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You did not panic. You trusted, you acted, and you learned." James felt warmth spread through him at her words. "I could not have done it without you," he admitted. "I would have been lost without your guidance." Nina smiled, but it was not a smile meant to flatter. It was a smile of recognition, of equality.
"We learn from each other," she said.
Strength is not in one person alone, but in those who walk together. That night, as they sat by the fire, James reflected on the day's events. The danger they had faced had revealed more than just the strength of the river or the skill of a settler. It had revealed the depth of their partnership. He realized that life with Nina was not about comfort or convenience, but it was about courage, trust, and facing the world together, no matter how difficult the path. Over the next few weeks, the bond between them deepened even further. Their daily routines of work and learning continued, but now they were intertwined with shared memories of the crisis. James began to anticipate Nina's instructions before she spoke, and she began to trust his judgment in ways she had not before. They moved with a quiet rhythm, each step guided by experience, observation, and mutual respect. Yet, as their partnership grew stronger, the settlement's opinions became harder to ignore. Some settlers began to speak more openly, questioning James' judgment and the unusual bond he shared with Nina. "A man should not live with an Apache woman," some would whisper. "It is dangerous, and it is not proper." James felt a flicker of doubt, a reminder that society's rules were not the same as the truths he had discovered with Nina. But Nina's presence reassured him.
"Do not let the words of others weigh on you," she said one evening, as they repaired a fence together.
"We know what is real between us,
The world may not understand, but that does not make it wrong. Her words reminded James why he had felt drawn to her from the very first day.
Breath. She did not demand change, nor did she seek approval from others. She lived with integrity and honesty, and her courage challenged him to rise above fear and judgment. He began to see that his life could no longer be defined by what others thought was acceptable. Life was about action, choice, and connection. One afternoon, as they tended the fields together, James noticed something he had not before. The way Nina moved, the ease with which she carried herself, the quiet confidence that seemed to come from knowing oneself fully. Desperate, he realized that he was not merely learning about survival or work. He was learning about life itself, about strength, patience, and the importance of trust. Nina, too, had come to understand James in ways that surprised her. His willingness to learn, and the kindness he showed to both people and animals. While he had started as a man struggling to survive alone, she now saw him as a partner, capable of making decisions, facing danger, and contributing to their shared life. Their relationship was no longer one of teacher and student or helper and lonely settler. It had grown into something deeper, something built on mutual respect and understanding. As spring turned to early summer, the forest around their cabin was alive with color and sound. The lessons of survival and partnership continued, but so did the quiet moments of reflection and connection. They would sit together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and sharing stories, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, but always present with one another. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Nina turned to James and said something that made his heart skip a beat. "You have come far," she said. "You understand more than survival now. You understand life, trust, and the strength of connection. That is why I said, then stay here with me. Because you have learned to walk beside me, not behind or ahead. You are ready to be part of something more than yourself." James felt a swell of emotion he could not fully express. He realized that Nina had given him something far greater than lessons or guidance. She had given him the courage to face the world honestly, to see life with clarity, and to embrace partnership in its truest form. He looked at her, gratitude and admiration mixing with something he could not yet name. Their bond, forged in work, trust, and shared experiences, had become unshakable. They had faced the fury of the river together, endured the skepticism of the settlement, and learned to navigate the differences between their worlds. In every challenge, they had grown closer, stronger, and more capable. James knew that life on the frontier would continue to test them. There would be storms, hardships, and dangers still ahead. But for the first time, he did not feel fear as he had before. With Nina beside him, he felt prepared to face whatever came. Together, they could overcome challenges, learn from one another, and build a life rooted not in expectation or convenience, but in courage, respect, and choice. And so, as the night fell and the stars emerged over the forest, James and Nina sat together, tired but fulfilled. They had survived the river, faced the judgments of the world, and discovered the strength of partnership. But life was not easy, nor would it ever be simple. But with trust, patience, and courage, they were ready to face it together, side by side, not just as teacher and student, or settler and stranger, but as companions, equals, and partners in every sense of the word. As summer settled into the settlement, life seemed to grow busier and louder. The days were long, filled with work in the fields, tending to animals, and repairing cabins after the occasional storm. Breaking. Yet, for James and Nina, their daily routines were no longer just about survival or learning. They were about building a life together. Their bond, formed through trust, respect, and shared challenges, had grown strong, but the world outside their cabin was beginning to test them in new ways. Word of their partnership had spread through the small community, and reactions were mixed. Some settlers admired the way Nina's knowledge had helped save livestock during the spring flood, or the way James had grown under her guidance. Others, however, were less approving. Whispers followed them wherever they went. "Why does James live with an Apache woman?" people would ask, sometimes loudly enough for others to hear. "It is not right. It is not proper." At first, James tried to ignore the murmurs. He focused on work, on the land, and on the lessons he was still learning from Nina. But over time, the whispers became harder to dismiss. Some neighbors avoided them entirely, refusing to speak or trade with them. Others openly criticized their choices, questioning James's judgment and warning of trouble if he continued to associate with an Apache woman. The tension was subtle at first, but it grew steadily, like a storm cloud approaching on the horizon. Nina noticed the change in James. He had grown more reserved, quieter than usual, and his eyes sometimes held worry. One evening, as they sat repairing a fence together, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not let the fear of others dictate your life," she said gently. "We know what is real between us. Their opinions do not change our truth." James took a deep breath, feeling both relief and frustration. Breath. He knew she was right. Their partnership was strong, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. But the pressure from the settlement weighed heavily on him. He realized that their challenge now was not just survival or learning. It was facing a world that might never fully accept them.
The following days brought more subtle tests.
Traders hesitated to sell goods to them. Children were warned not to play near their cabin, and even friends of James's family looked uneasy when visiting. The couple faced these challenges quietly, supporting each other with small acts of kindness and reassurance. When neighbors turned their backs, James and Nina turned to one another, drawing strength from their connection rather than resentment or anger. Despite the judgment, their life together continued to flourish in small, meaningful ways. They worked side by side in the fields, tended to the animals, and spent evenings by the fire, sharing stories and lessons. Rasp. James began to see that life was about balance, accepting the hardships imposed by the world while celebrating the joys found in small victories and companionship. Breaths brought calm to even the most stressful situations, and he learned to approach challenges with patience rather than frustration. One afternoon, a particularly harsh argument broke out among the settlers. A neighbor confronted James openly, criticizing his choice to live with Nina. "A man should not associate with the Apache," the man shouted, his face red with anger. "It is dangerous, and it will bring ruin to your family and your land." James felt his heart pound, a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief coursing through him. For a moment, he considered retreating, apologizing, or backing down to avoid conflict. But Nina stood beside him, calm and unwavering. "Psst." She placed a hand on his arm and looked him in the eyes. "Stand firm," she said. "Do not let their fear control your choices." Drawing courage from her words, James took a deep breath. "My life, my choices, and my partnerships are not for you to judge," he said firmly. "We have faced challenges together, learned from one another, and built something real. That is enough for us." The neighbor scowled, clearly frustrated that his words had no power over James. Breath. Slowly he walked away, muttering under his breath. James felt a mixture of relief and pride. For the first time, he realized that their bond was not only about survival or partnership. It was a statement of courage, a refusal to let prejudice dictate the path of their lives. As the weeks passed, James and Nina found allies in unexpected places. Some settlers began to see the value of Nina's knowledge, her skill with animals, her understanding of the land, and her practical solutions to everyday challenges. They began to respect her presence, if not fully, then at least enough to accept it quietly. Slowly, the community began to recognize that the partnership between James and Nina was not a threat but a source of strength and resilience. Within the cabin, Life became a mixture of joy and continued learning.
They experimented with new farming techniques, blending settler methods with Nina's knowledge of natural remedies and sustainable practices. They built furniture together, repaired tools, and crafted items that combined both traditions.
These shared projects strengthened their connection, reinforcing the idea that life was richer when two people learned from and supported one another. James also noticed subtle changes in himself. He had grown more confident, not just in his work, but in his presence in the community. He learned to speak with respect and firmness when confronted, to defend his choices without anger, and to stand beside Nina with pride rather than fear. He began to understand that true courage was not only facing physical danger, but also living authentically in the face of societal pressure. Nina, too, had grown. She had initially approached James with caution, knowing the risks of being part of a settlement that might not accept her. But she saw his sincerity, his willingness to learn, and his respect for her culture. Over time, she allowed herself to trust fully, to share her experiences and emotions more openly, and to envision a life where they could face the world together. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset behind the hills, James spoke quietly. "I never imagined life could be like this," he said. "I feared judgment, danger, and loneliness, but now I see that with you, I am not afraid. You have taught me more than I could have imagined. Not just about survival, but about life itself." Nina smiled, reaching out to take his hand. "And you have shown me that trust and partnership can bridge worlds," she said. "We are stronger together than we could ever be apart." That is the lesson that matters most. The weeks turned into months, and their life together continued to thrive despite the ongoing scrutiny from some neighbors. They celebrated small victories, like a successful harvest, a healthy calf born on the farm, or a quiet evening by the fire filled with laughter. Each day reinforced their bond and reminded them that the world outside their cabin could not diminish the life they were creating together. As summer drew to a close, James and Nina began to dream about the future. They talked quietly about what they wanted their home to look like, how they could continue to learn from one another, and the ways they could contribute to the community while remaining true to themselves. They discussed raising children, blending traditions, and building a life that honored both their worlds. Through all of this, the challenges they faced from society remained a presence, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct. But James and Nina had learned to navigate them with patience, courage, and unwavering trust in each other. They knew that life would continue to present obstacles, but they also knew that together they could meet them, not with fear or resentment, but with strength, wisdom, and partnership. One particularly quiet evening, as the stars appeared above the forest, Nina turned to James with a soft smile. "We have faced the opinions of others, the doubts and the fears," she said. "And yet here we are, stronger, wiser, and more united. That is how we will continue, side by side, no matter what the world thinks." James felt a warmth in his chest, a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they had shared. Wow. From the moment she had arrived at his cabin, speaking words that had startled him, to this point where their partnership had survived challenge, judgment, and fear, he realized that he had never truly lived until he had walked this path with Nina.
Their home, their partnership, and their shared life had become a quiet beacon of resilience.
It was a testament to the power of trust, respect, and courage, and a reminder that even in a world filled with prejudice and expectation, life could be lived fully when two people chose to walk together. And so, as the cool night air settled over the cabin and the forest whispered in the distance, James and Nina sat together, their hands entwined, their hearts aligned, and their minds filled with hope. The challenges of society had tested them, but they had faced them together, proving that the strength of partnership and the courage to live authentically could overcome even the harshest judgments. Life was not easy, nor would it ever be simple, but for James and Nina, The world had become a place where love, trust, and respect mattered more than fear or opinion. Together, they had carved out a space of understanding, strength, and possibility. A space where they could grow, learn, and live fully, no matter what challenges lay ahead.
Years passed, and life continued to unfold in ways that James and Nina could never have imagined.
Their partnership, forged through courage, trust, and countless shared challenges, had grown into something far deeper than either had expected. Their home had become a place of warmth, learning, and life. Standing at the edge of the settlement, surrounded by the forest that had first brought them together, children came into their lives, and with them new joys and responsibilities. Breaths. James and Nina taught them not only the skills needed to survive in the frontier, but also the lessons of respect, understanding, and connection that had shaped their own bond. They taught the children to read the land, to observe the animals and the weather, to understand the balance of nature, and to honor both their heritages. Nights were filled with stories from both worlds, tales of the settlers' past and wisdom from the Apache traditions. Their home became a small center of learning, where generations could see the beauty of blending knowledge, culture, and values. The challenges they had once faced from the settlement had not disappeared entirely, but over time people began to accept their life as it was. The neighbors who had once whispered or frowned now looked on with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Some even came to seek advice from Nina on tending their land or from James on managing the cabin and fields. Their perseverance, courage, and dedication to life had earned the recognition of a community that had once doubted them. Through all of this, James often thought back to the day Nina had first spoken to him, standing boldly at the edge of the forest and saying, "I heard you needed a wife. Then stay here with me." He remembered the mixture of shock, curiosity, and admiration he had felt, and how that single moment had changed the course of his life. Without her arrival, without her courage and honesty, he knew he would still be living in solitude, struggling against the harshness of the frontier without the richness of connection. Nina, too, reflected on their journey. She remembered how carefully she had approached him at first, cautious yet determined to offer guidance and partnership. She thought of the lessons she had taught him, the dangers they had faced together, and the trust that had grown between them. And she smiled at the realization that James had not only learned from her but had become a partner she could rely on, a companion who shared her values, her courage, and her love of life. One crisp morning as the sun rose over the forest, James and Nina walked together to the river. The same river that had once rushed violently during the flood now flowed gently, reflecting the blue sky and the green canopy of trees. They paused on the bank, watching the water and listening to the birds singing in the trees. James took Nina's hand in his, feeling the years of shared experience in the simple warmth of her grasp. "Do you remember the first day you came here?" James asked, his voice soft but steady. Nina nodded, her eyes reflecting the light of the rising sun. "I do," she said. "I remember seeing you, alone, unsure, and knowing that we could face the world together if you chose to trust me." "And I did trust you. I had no idea how much my life would change, or how much richer it would become because of you." Their children ran along the riverbank, laughing and playing, their voices carrying across the water. James and Nina watched them with quiet pride, seeing in them a blending of worlds, traditions, and knowledge that neither of them could have imagined alone. Their children were the living proof of partnership, trust, and courage. As the years continued, their cabin and land grew. The small home expanded with new rooms for the children and additional space for work and storage. Gardens flourished, livestock thrived, and the home became a small hub of learning and cooperation. Visitors came from neighboring settlements to see the couple, to learn from Nina's wisdom, or to hear James's stories of survival and growth. James often reflected on how much he had learned from Nina, not only about the land and survival, but also about life itself. He had learned patience, understanding, and the importance of listening. because he had learned that strength was not only physical but also emotional and spiritual, rooted in trust and connection. He had learned that true partnership was about equality, respect, and shared courage. Nina, in turn, had seen how James had grown into a man of wisdom, skill, and resilience. She had seen him face danger without fear, stand against judgment with dignity, and embrace life fully with courage and determination. Together they had created a life that was greater than the sum of its parts, a life rich with learning, love, and shared purpose. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, James and Nina sat together on the porch, their hands entwined. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the sound of crickets. Their children played nearby, laughing and chasing one another in the fading light. James looked at Nina, feeling the depth of their shared journey. "We have faced so much together," he said quietly. "Danger, fear, judgment, and challenge. And yet, here we are, stronger, wiser, and more alive than I ever imagined." Nina smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Yes," she said, softly. "Narration. And it is not because life has been easy, but because we have chosen to face it together. That is the greatest lesson of all." Rasp. As night fell, the stars appeared, shining brightly over the forest and the cabin. James and Nina sat in comfortable silence, reflecting on the years of struggle, learning, and growth. They had survived floods, harsh winters, and societal pressure. They had learned from one another, taught their children, and built a home filled with life, love, and knowledge. Their bond had endured because it was rooted in respect, courage, and trust. A bond that could never be broken by fear or judgment. In the quiet moments, James thought about the legacy they were leaving. It was not wealth or fame, but something far more valuable. A life lived fully, honestly, and courageously. He had learned that the choices one makes, the partnerships one nurtures, and the love one offers could create ripples that shape not only their own life, but the lives of those who came after. Nina, too, understood the legacy they were creating. She saw in their children the blending of traditions, knowledge, and wisdom that would continue to influence the community long after they were gone. She knew that their courage and partnership had set an example, proving that respect, trust, and love could bridge worlds, overcome fear, and shape a meaningful life.
As they prepared for bed that night, the cabin quiet except for the soft breathing of their children, James took Nina's hand once more. "I am grateful for every moment," he said.
"From the first day you came to my cabin to now, every step has been worth it. And I am grateful," she replied. "For your trust, your courage, and your willingness to walk beside me. Life is richer because we chose it together." Desperation.
Years continued to pass, and the seasons changed as they always did. Winter brought snow, spring brought growth, and summer and autumn brought work, harvest, and reflection.
Through it all, James and Nina remained steadfast partners, facing each challenge with patience, wisdom, and shared strength. They celebrated small victories and endured hardships, knowing that life was not defined by ease but by the courage to face it honestly. Eventually, as they grew older, they began to reflect more on the story of their lives, the journey from loneliness and fear to connection and courage. They remembered the flood, the whispered criticisms, the challenges of learning from one another, and the countless quiet moments that had shaped their bond. And they understood that the true meaning of life was not in avoiding hardship, but in embracing it with integrity, respect, and partnership. James and Nina's story became a quiet legend in the settlement. Neighbors told of the couple who had faced danger together, who had bridged worlds, and who had raised children with wisdom and love. Their legacy was not only the life they had built, but also the example they had set, That courage, respect, and trust could overcome fear, judgment, and difference. And in the end, as they sat together by the fire one quiet night, hands intertwined, hearts full and minds at peace, James and Nina knew that their life had been extraordinary, not because it was easy, but because it had been lived fully, honestly, and together.
Brave-there. Their journey had begun with a single bold statement. I heard you needed a wife. Then stay here with me.
From that moment forward, they had faced the world side by side, learned from one another, and created a life that was strong, meaningful, and lasting. It was a life built on courage, partnership, and love, the kind of life that endures, not just in memory, but in the hearts of those who witness it and the generations that follow. And as the stars shone brightly above their cabin, James and Nina knew that they had found something rare and beautiful, a life lived together, fully and without regret.